There's so much pain in the world. There's so much pain in the world, and we all know it's true, of course, right? But until it becomes our pain, it doesn't become a question or a problem. Of course, the pain's all there, even when it's not ours. It's just all there. We're just living our lives. When it invades our personal space, so we kind of wake up and say, what does that mean? How do we live in it? Is there a way to create a conversation around it? Or does it just silence all conversation? So the first book that I wrote was called Safek, Uncertainty, and it was about reclaiming uncertainty as a spiritual value. Right? What is uncertainty as a value? We usually set up spirit as the place of certainty, and I tried to allow myself to stay in spirit, and the only way I could do it was to maybe suggest that what spirit's about is about kind of living in uncertainty in a certain way. And so I want to just open up that question. We'll start with Ken. How do I approach, and we'll go back and forth, how do I approach living in a world where there's so much radical evil? Doesn't it just override everything? What do I do with it?
I'm uncertain. That's extraordinary. Let me give a few introductory remarks as well. Mark wanted to talk about several concepts, and one is evil, and I think evil is a good way to actually name the problem, because in some ways evil is a little bit archaic, a phrase. Certainly bad things happen. Bad things happen to good-looking people, which is really extremely weird, and probably the hardest to explain. But bad things just also happen. And if you get into any of the tradition spiritual paths, and I'm going to take Buddhism as an example, because you can't get away from the notion of karma at that point. And I think this is a very, very, very important issue to touch on. We can circle back to it in some of the terms that you mentioned, because it does all tie up. But because we're all, to some extent, whether we think in terms of karma, specifically in the Buddhist sense, we have a kind of a native tendency to think like that, which is something bad has happened to me, therefore I have done something bad to deserve it. Now, in some cases that may be true, but in some cases it may not. How to determine that's very difficult. And by the way, we don't get a lot of help from the traditions in this. And let me give you one example why I think that's true. Because what we're talking here now is about, if we can make a distinction between something bad happened and something evil. And one of the differences, there are many, but evil implies intent, doesn't it? Evil is something that's trying to do something bad. So a bad thing can happen, I slip and fall with something, bad things happen. Evil implies intent. Now the notion of karma is that when a bad thing happens to you, it's because of a prior evil intent. A prior evil intent made the bad thing happen to you now. So even accidental bad things that happen to you are your fault. Now, that's an interesting sort of way to look at it. In strict Theravada Buddhist sense, everything that happens to you in this life, you're simply reading a book that you wrote in a previous life. Now, there are reasons to believe some of that, but as is so often with the traditions, it's a very good idea that needs to be reinterpreted in the light of modern and postmodern knowledge, because it just doesn't hold up very well. At the same time, we don't want to simply get off of the notion that there is a kind of a karmic stream.